The Birth of American Labor, Terence Powderly, Samuel Gompers, and Henry George, Mutual Support and Conflicts, written and narrated by Edward J. Dodson. Presented at the conference of the Council of Georgist Organizations held in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Wednesday, 24 July 2019. The author acknowledges the valuable suggestions received from Alexandra Lau and H. William Batt, who kindly reviewed an earlier draft of this paper. When Henry George was born in 1839, the city of his birth, Philadelphia, was not yet an industrializing seaport. The city had lost its dominant position as a commercial center to New York City. The seats of the state and federal governments had departed, and the city slowly adapted. In 1835, rising tensions between the industrialists and their workers resulted in the first general labor strike in North America. By the time Henry George left his formal schooling behind in 1855, mechanization was displacing manual labor. 16-year-old Henry George was not ready to accept whatever work might be available to him in Philadelphia. He sought adventure and joined the crew of a ship sailing to Australia and India. He spent 15 months at sea. Upon his return home, months passed before George secured work as a printer's apprentice. An older printer observed to him in conversation that in old and settled countries, workers are paid low wages, but that in new countries, workers are paid much higher wages. Some years later, George would investigate this issue and offer an explanation for why this was so. Two individuals who were destined to form an alliance of opportunity with Henry George during 1886 were just beginning their own lives. Terence Powderly was born in 1849 to Irish parents who had come to the United States in 1827, as so many other Irish families had done during this period. Samuel Gompers was born in 1850 in London. His family immigrated to the United States in 1863, establishing residence in New York City. As a young man, Powderly first found work with the railroad, eventually becoming a machinist. Gompers worked at home in the family cigar business, eventually going to work in 1873 for a cigar company where the workers were unionized. In 1871, Terence Powderly joined the Machinists and Blacksmiths International Union, was the next year elected its secretary, and eventually its president. George was again drawn to the sea, and by the sea made his way to California with some hope of making his way to the gold fields. By the early 1870s, George had tried and failed at different ways to establish himself, married and began a family, and slowly found his way to significant insights into the causes of the economic crises that dictated his own fortunes. His skill as a typesetter, his insatiable curiosity, and his growing mastery of language finally set him on a career path, first as reporter, then editor, then newspaper publisher. What Henry George had come to understand with increasing clarity was expressed in his 1868 article, "What the Railroad Will Bring Us." He wrote, "For years, the high rate of interest and high rate of wages prevailing in California have been special subjects for a certain school of local political economists, who could not see that high wages and high interest were indications that the natural wealth of the country was not yet monopolized, that great opportunities were open to all." What Henry George was referring to by interest was not the cost of borrowing. Interest, as used in political economy, referred to that portion of production rightfully returned to those who employ tools, machinery, other forms of capital goods, as well as the workers who utilize them. The agent of theft of wages and interest from those who produced wealth, George concluded, was monopoly privilege, and the monopoly control over nature particularly. A significant development in Henry George's analysis appeared in 1871 in a small book titled Our Land and Land Policy. Its importance for George's future writing is captured by Henry George biographer Charles Albro Barker. Barker writes, George in Our Land and Land Policy was arriving as an original thinker, as a critic, as an editor and writer informed on public affairs, as an influence in the Democratic Party. As a tractarian he had arrived. The California to which Henry George arrived as a young man quickly changed. He had come to see firsthand the power of monopoly in the form of the railroad. His fellow Californians responded by calling for reforms. A People's Independent Party emerged in 1873 to fight not only the railroads, but against monopoly and legislative corruption. They emerged with a majority in the state legislature. In 1866, an article by Henry George in support of a bill mandating an 8-hour workday appeared in the Sacramento Daily Union. A few years before Henry George died, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner delivered a paper titled The Significance of the Frontier in American History at a meeting of the American Historical Association in Chicago. His essay, his assertions and conclusions sparked decades of debate among historians over the role played by life on the frontier in the shaping of cultural norms and political institutions in the United States. The decades to follow brought increasing skepticism and criticism of Turner and his defenders. In a 1968 volume edited by historians Richard Hofstadter and Seymour Martin Lipset, Turner and the Sociology of the Frontier, one historian after another presents evidence countering the assertion that access to free or very cheap land served as an effective safety valve to absorb excess population from the East and helped to prevent the wages of industrial workers from falling to subsistence. Detailed analysis of census data and other available statistics revealed that most of the farms started on the frontier as the frontier moved westward were started by existing farmers who sold land in the east to acquire larger, more fertile lands. Wealthy individuals acquired land for speculation. A large portion of those who moved to the frontier farms did so as hired laborers, then eventually moved into the towns to seek work, as farmers fell into debt during periods of economic crisis or natural disaster. Cities became the places where skilled craftsmen formed craft unions to set prices for their work and defend against competition from foreign migrants. The National Labor Union was formed in 1866, followed in 1869 by the Knights of Labor, organized in Philadelphia by Uriah S. Stevens. By 1886, the Knights of Labor grew to 700,000 members. However, the progress of the trades union movement suffered a serious setback when the Panic of 1873 led to 5 years of depressed economic conditions. That year, Terence Powderly was dismissed from his job because as head of the union, it was feared he would cause trouble. He found work in Canada for a while, then returned in 1874 to settle in Oil City, Pennsylvania. In 1879, he was elected Grand Master Workman of the Knights of Labor, remaining in this office until 1893. Powderly's biographers note that he was influenced by the greenback ideology of producerism rather than by socialism, and so regarded most employers as producers with whom the union must work while standing up for workers' rights. In 1878, Powderly became the candidate of the Greenback Labor Party for the office of Mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and was elected to the first of 3 two-year terms. During the campaign, he proposed financing public work projects through low-interest government loans as a means of providing work for the many unemployed. After assuming office, he immediately enacted moderate reforms, including the creation of a Board of Health, a sewage system, street paving, a new police force and fire department, and an investigation of municipal corruption, resulting in more efficient tax collection. The rise of Samuel Gompers in the trades union movement began with his election in 1875 to the office of president of the Cigar Makers International Union, Local 144. It was in 1881 that Gompers and other union leaders established a loose organization of unions that eventually became the American Federation of Labor. The paths of Henry George and these two giants of organized labor were about to become entangled. A small author's proof edition of Progress and Poverty was sold during 1879, while Henry George remained in California. By a remarkable circumstance, a recent immigrant from Germany read a copy of the author's proof edition and contacted Henry George requesting permission to translate Progress and Poverty into German, greatly increasing the book's readership. At the urging of and with a small amount of financial assistance from John Russell Young, Henry George boarded a train for New York in August of 1880 to promote the book. George's first opportunities to engage the public in New York were on the tariff question, although Democratic Party officials quickly realized that his free trade principles were far more radical than the party's timid call for tariff reform. By 1881, over 1,000 copies of an inexpensive edition sold, as well as the first printing of a hardback edition. The German language edition was also selling well in Europe and in the United States. Henry George next took up the issues plaguing the people of Ireland, producing The Irish Land Question, What It Involves, and How Alone It Can Be Settled. The pamphlet was reprinted by publishers in London, Manchester, and Glasgow. The Central Labor Union invited him to speak at a meeting held in support of Irish tenants. George also became a member of the Knights of Labor and proudly stepped forward and, quote, made a personal declaration on the land question and helped Mr. George, who had joined the order, to get Progress and Poverty and the land question into the local assemblies. Henry George wrote to Powderly, I believe that the promulgation by you of those views marks an epoch in the labor movement. They will powerfully aid in bringing about, among the working classes, that discussion of fundamental principles so much needed and without which nothing else can be accomplished. The extent to which Powderly had come to embrace Henry George's design for systemic change rather than simply acting opportunistically to take advantage of George's growing public following is raised by Charles Albro Barker. Terence Powderly himself derived from Irish origins, and so also did great numbers of the Knights of Labor, and Michael Davitt had become a knight while in the United States. As Davitt had done in 1882, Terence Powderly now said things which half promised that he would become a follower of Henry George. Among the rank-and-file members of the Knights of Labor, however, Henry George did not command a strong and lasting loyalty among New York members. What Henry George sought was to set in motion unstoppable momentum for the systemic reforms he knew were essential to change the course of history. The labor movement in the United States recognized Henry George as a person whose reputation for honesty, integrity, and commitment to service could serve as a spark to put labor on the map. Upon learning of Henry George's death late in 1897, Michael Davitt responded with a heartfelt remembrance appearing in the December issue of the Single Tax. Davitt wrote, No other reformer of this century has held so unique a position as George has occupied in the English-speaking world. Greater men there have been, of course, within the circumscribed bounds of nations as political leaders and statesmen. But George was neither a statesman nor a politician, and yet not alone in his own country, but here in Great Britain and in Ireland and away at the Antipodes, he evoked an enthusiasm for the great principle he stood for, such as no other man of the century has called into existence without the accessories of party machinery or the platform of a parliament. Disaster struck the Knights of Labor with the Haymarket Square riot in Chicago on May 4, 1886. Anarchists were blamed, and 2 of them were Knights. Bitter factionalism divided the Union, and its forays into electoral politics failed. Late in December of 1886, Henry George left for a lecture tour of the British Isles, a tour financed by Patrick Ford, editor of the largest Irish-American newspaper in the nation. Upon his return, he was honored by a mass meeting at Cooper Union, even as most of those who enjoyed the benefits of entrenched privilege began to recognize the threat his ideas held and drew away. When George wrote in the Standard that he agreed with the Illinois Supreme Court that the evidence supported conviction of those accused of the Haymarket bombing, labor activists felt betrayed. They ignored George's insight that the enemy was corruption, and the right response was, quote, our duty as citizens to address ourselves to the adjustment of social wrongs. Gompers, as head of the newly formed American Federation of Labor, perceived George's view that closed union shops were a form of protection as basically anti-labor. Although the AFL declared its intent to represent the interests of all workers, the national units had created an organization comprised only of the skilled trades. Gompers accepted the practice of trade autonomy, which recognized each national union's right to regulate its own internal affairs. Charles Albro Barker repeats the details of how the Central Labor Union decided to approach Henry George and ask him to accept their nomination to run for the office of mayor of New York City. The idea was supposedly put to, quote, a group of trades union men by Joseph Jackson, a reporter for the New York Herald. Asked on August 20th if he would accept the party's nomination, George agreed on condition that 30,000 people would sign a document assuring him of their support. George then rewrote the party platform. The main plank was to be the single tax on land values, with other labor demands included. In a letter to Edward Taylor, George revealed his true reasons for accepting. He wrote, it is by no means impossible that I shall be elected, but the one thing sure is that if I do go into the fight, the campaign will bring the land question into practical politics and do more to popularize its discussion than years of writing will do. This is the only temptation to me. Thus, one of George's hopes was that he could get labor leaders such as Powderly and Gompers to embrace the mission of destroying monopoly privilege and landed privilege in particular from the American system. In an address he delivered in 1884 titled, Is Our Civilization Just to Working Men?, George put it this way. A man may toil from early manhood to hoary age to increase his gains. He may in the struggle for wealth wear out his body, distort his mind, warp his instincts, and lose his soul, and yet be not a working man, his struggle being merely to take, not to make. Despite heroic efforts, Henry George was not elected mayor of New York City. He came in second to Abram Hewitt, but ahead of Theodore Roosevelt. After the election, Powderly, quote, declined membership in any continuing Labor Party and said that he would make no more partisan speeches. Moreover, he declared that the Knights of Labor should stay out of politics altogether. Gompers also decided to remove himself from Labor Party politics. George and the labor movement had reached the high point of collaboration. Labor would experience many decades of hard struggle to establish the right of collective bargaining and achieve other changes in law. The time for the single tax had already seemingly come and gone even before Henry George's death in 1897. George moved forward with his plan to establish a newspaper of his own. The first issue of the Standard appeared on the 8th of January, 1887. Others, including Father Edward McGlynn, took charge of organizing the United Labor Party, purging socialists from the party. To Henry George, the socialist program sought the elimination of private property in the, quote, instruments of production, that is, in capital goods. His principles prevented him from any alliance with socialist leaders. In the upcoming election, the office of Governor of New York State was not in play. However, pushed by Edward McGlynn, George agreed to run for the office of Secretary of State. The United Labor Party suffered a strong defeat from which the party could not recover. The situation is described by historian Stephen Ross. The pressures that brought about the party's collapse were not purely internal. George's organization faced the combined opposition of mainstream parties, clergy, and capitalists. Democrats and Republicans in New York and elsewhere responded to the threat of a new third party by pooling their forces to defeat ULP candidates and moving to co-opt party leaders and moderate party demands into their own organizations. Henry George then stunned United Labor Party leaders by backing the re-election of Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, for the presidency. A primary objective of the United Labor Party was to drive the Tammany Hall Democrats from power. Soon thereafter, the 23rd Assembly District Organization of the United Labor Party formally expelled Henry George. George sought solutions to the problems of all working people, including those who owned businesses and employed others. Labor leaders sought to control the supply of labor and used collective bargaining to negotiate a fair level of wages and safe working conditions. Gompers was in the vanguard of several generations of labor leaders who wanted nothing more than to lift the economic well-being of workers into an expanding middle class. As Gompers' biographer Bernard Mandel explained in 1956, the transformation of Gompers from a militant and radical agitator to a conservative labor bureaucrat was symptomatic of a general trend among the skilled workers in the 1890s and early 1900s. While the masses were becoming more radical under the impact of the growing power of the trusts and their subversion of governments to their tools, while they were moving toward industrial unionism and independent political action and populism, the conservative leaders of the craft unions were, like the steel union, yielding to the monopolies, entering into a period of trade agreements and protocols, joining the National Civic Federation, avoiding clashes with the trusts and the government, buying a limited security and higher wages for their members at the expense of the unskilled workers and the consumers. By the beginning of 1897, George was feeling rather older than a man of 58 might. Yet he did his best to focus his energy on completion of The Science of Political Economy, the book he hoped would serve to overcome all objections raised to his analysis. He would then put aside this work to accept the call to run as an independent candidate for the office of mayor of New York City. He was true to his principles to the very end. Speaking 5 days before the election, he told the audience of mostly working men, "I have never claimed to be a special friend of labor. What I stand for is the equal rights of all men. He died the following morning, and the world mourned the loss of this sincere, caring man. From almost the very beginning of George's campaign for systemic reform, one of his most stalwart supporters was Lewis F. Post. A prominent New York attorney, Post served as editor of the Standard during its short life. In 1913, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson to the Cabinet Office of Assistant Secretary of Labor. In his 1916 Labor Day address, Post challenged, quote, wage workers to embrace a mission beyond the, quote, struggle to keep up wages. Post pointed to the fundamental cause of the economic struggles faced by so many people. Our government has given away to corporations millions upon millions of acres of our common lands. What we have not given away has been monopolized by purchase, so that now more than half our people are tenants, and there is hardly any more public land left. Of the other half of our people, a very few own nearly all the land of the country. Shall these conditions continue? They need not. You all know what land value is. It is the price that is given to localities by growing populations, by general improvement, and by good government in those localities. Land value is the financial measure of social progress. In justice, it belongs not to the landowner, but to the community. In justice, it should be taken for common use. If that be not done, the common fund will go into private pockets. This will encourage speculation in land, and speculation in land discourages the use of land. Speculation narrows opportunities for employment by keeping land out of use. In that way, speculation in land values makes wage workers dependent. It forces them into labor organizations, and it puts even labor organizations at a disadvantage in the struggle with highly privileged employers. Fast forward to the year 2019. Would a current Assistant Secretary of Labor have the understanding or the courage to call for an end to the private taking of the value of the nation's land and natural resources as key to the liberation of labor? Will the leaders of the modern labor movement come to recognize and embrace Henry George's program of systemic reform as key to the liberation of labor? Thank you.